The following podcast is sponsored by Structure Tech.
I was just going to ask, Vickie, where do you see most commonly mold? You said carpet, basement carpet was number one.
Yep.
But where are the top 5 places you typically see it?
Welcome, everybody. You're listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. My name is Bill Ulrich, alongside my co-hosts, as always, Tessa Murray and Reuben Saltzman. We are in part 2 of our mold conversation with Vickie Swenson, the owner of Minnesota Mold Inspections, LLC. Please remember the LLC when you're Googling Vickie's company. And we spent the whole first episode talking about mold and how Vickie got into the business, and we identified some types of mold, and we said that we were going to come back and get into part 2 was going to be all about testing and remediation and those kinds of things. So I know, Reuben, you've got some questions. I'm going to throw it over to you and let you go and run with it.
Yeah, sure. One of the biggest things that people seem to freak out about is when you have stains in the attic. And it seems to be one of the most contentious ones, too, where sometimes we'll see a little bit of rusty discoloration at nail tips and maybe a little bit of staining on the sheathing. And, we'll call it out as such. We'll say, what's going on? You had condensation up here. And then, I remember one transaction specifically where we had said that. And then a contractor came out later and said, this attic is covered in mold. Your home inspector should have told you there's mold everywhere, and this is a big deal, and you need to have all the sheathing torn off and all that jazz. We'll get that extreme, and then we'll get the other extreme where it's like you've got clear growth. I'm sorry, but
fuzzy stuff on trusses. Yeah.
I know there's a lot of home inspectors. This whole topic. I could go so many levels deep with this question right now, and I know I am. But, there are a lot of home inspectors who completely insist you can never identify mold by looking at it. And I feel like there are some materials that are clearly mold where I know it by looking at it. Like when it's fuzzy and it's something that's growing, I don't need to test this. I know what this is. Yeah. Let me ask you, do you have the ability, I'm changing my question. Do you have the ability to look at something sometimes and just know that this is mold growth? Is that possible?
On sheetrock, if I see green spots or white spots next to a water heater, yes. In an attic, even I can't tell on wood after 15 years.
Okay.
So attic mold is so common, I probably work on one a week in the summer. And it's interesting, I'll say a lot of home inspectors walk past all other sorts of mold, and for whatever reason they call out the attic. Mm-hmm. And so when people call about that, and there was one that actually followed up, Structure Tech did about 2 months ago in Minnetonka. Well, Structure Tech found mold in the attic. I'm like, well, do I need to test it? As soon as they showed me the picture, nope, don't need to test it. And how could I tell? There had been a problem, attic painted white, now the mold's growing on the white. So I can tell. It had been a problem, someone remediated it, they didn't take care of the moisture source, and now it's back. That we don't need to test that.
Yeah.
So you're right. Most attic mold, people think, well, I never had a roof leak. Most attic mold comes from condensation. It gets up there during the winter. If warm air rises, stack effect, chimney effect, warm air rises. It goes up there, it condenses. Sometimes you get a raining attic. So what I tell people is when they call, I say, what's the approximate age of the house? If they say 100 years old, then I definitely have to test it because it could be tannin, it could be the color of the wood, it could be who knows what. It could have been mold 60 years ago because the first mold class said, mold can lay dormant for hundreds of years. I found that if you test an attic that's had mold 60 years ago and it's been dry for 60 years, you might not get any spores. Mm-hmm. So the newer the house, if I hear it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years old and it's dark, probably mold. But then the next question is, there are different methods to clean it.
Yeah.
And the big question is, can we save our insulation?
Sure.
90% of the people just clean the sheathing. They don't get rid of the insulation.
Okay.
The biggest question is, okay, so we're going to spend all this money cleaning. It will probably either dry ice blast. There are some chemicals now. RMR 86 is showing some promise. What I haven't been able to go back 10 years later to see, it looks good after the cleaning. Is it really good 10 years down the road? So it's still really an abrasive. Whenever you're removing mold from wood, vacuum, sand, treat, and maybe seal.
Wow.
But the thing is, how do you know that it's not going to come back? There's a really good group called the Minnesota Building Performance Association, mbpa.us. Those guys, building scientists from the U, are you in that group, Tess?
Mm-hmm. Well, I used to be for a while. And Structure Tech.
Structure Tech is a member of that group. Yeah. We're the only home inspection company who is a member of that group.
Mm-hmm. It's an amazing group, and those are the people that I trust. Ross Anderson is the current president going out. And I said, you need to have these guys to the house. It's not an insulator, because I just saw one by 50th in France. Oh, spray foam. A spray foam contractor Spray foam's the answer to everything. So he spray foamed these whole attic alcoves, and you could smell the moisture behind. And I saw it, and I felt so bad for them. Like, you need to call Pat Hillman at the University of Minnesota and ask him if this is really a good idea. It's really that group, because there was a client I worked for, really nice gentleman. He noticed the mold in his attic, so he put in more insulation, got more mold. So I always say it's that insulation and ventilation has to work together. And it's not necessarily the insulators or the roofers or contractor, it's those guys that can tell you what you have to do to make sure it doesn't come back.
Yeah, air sealing attic bypasses. That's the keys, stopping that warm air from getting into the attic so it doesn't create all that moisture. So I have a couple questions then. So you mentioned some different types of tests that you do to test for mold. How reliable are they? Does it depend on the season and how wet the house is, or,
So a surface test, the two types of tests I run are testing for airborne spores. That's pretty consistent. Of course, the spores can go up and down with the season. There are people that say can change in 10 minutes. I have had really good luck with predictability. As far as when testing the attic, I would never do an air test in an attic. I would always test that with a swab. It's a Q-tip-like device. You collect some of that darkness. You send it to the lab. It's very reliable. I tested a crawl space recently, early in the summer, and got low spores. I retested it after the hot, humid summer and got a whole different situation. So, yes, there are all sorts of variables that can make the spores change. However, I still say if I'm in a basement with white and green mold, my nose is running, time and time again, I run it, I get high spores. When Wells Fargo had a lot of foreclosures, I tested probably 60 that were cleaned by a really good remediator. He got the spores to 350 every time. So when I'm testing in an extremely moldy place or an extremely clean place, time and time again, they come back as predicted. So in a gray area where I can't tell, I trust them.
What do you have to say about mold in a bathroom? You got black stuff growing on the grout, on the caulk lines, ceiling. One of the most common places we see this.
Yep. Well, when people call me about the ceiling, they say one big spot or a lot of little spots. One big spot, something's leaking from above. You're going to have to cut that out. A lot of little spots, that's just humidity. I believe you can clean that. Now, in the tile and grout, as I said, that was the first thing they taught us in mold class. That is not a big deal. I like, there's some really good tile and grout cleaning companies. Maybe you should have, if you can't keep it away, hire a professional grout cleaner. They can clean it and seal it. Now, if you can push the tiles, I was in one, I could put my finger through the tile, different story. So that's kind of how it is. It's really common sense. It's like if your walls are really sound and that's really just on the grout, that's not a big deal. But if your sheetrock's getting soft, that's a huge deal.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there with just a little tip for anybody wanting to check their own house, or you want to inspect your own houses when you're going through them. As our little trick is to go around and just knock on tiles. Just little, is this going to pick it up in the microphone? Little tap, tap, tap with your knuckle all around any suspected areas. And when you hear that tone change, you know that something's going on in the wall, especially if you hear tiles that sound hollow. That's our little trick. And it's just a dead giveaway that you've got a problem with that wall.
So, okay, I've got a couple questions, but we have to take a break, don't we, Bill?
And when we get back, Tessa's going to ask her 2 questions, and then I promise we are going to go through the different testing procedures that Vickie does. You've been listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone. Bill Ulrich from Structure Talk. We talk a lot about maintenance on the podcast. If you're like me, I'd rather be doing anything other than maintaining my house. Problem is, my neglectful nature can bring unexpected surprises. So what's a fantasy football fan like me to do? Punt! That's why I recommend Cura Home Maintenance. They actually like home maintenance, and they're happy to do it for you. For a couple dollars a day, they'll keep your home on track. They free you up to enjoy your weekends. Check them out at curahome.com. That's K-U-R-A home.com. Gotta get back to the game. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. I'm Bill Ulrich, alongside Tessa Murray and Reuben Saltzman, and we've been talking with Vickie Swenson from Minnesota Mold Inspections, LLC. So, Tess, I'm going to throw it right back to you. You've got questions.
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask, Vickie, where do you see most commonly mold? You said carpet, basement carpet was number 1.
Yep.
But, where are the top 5 places you typically see it?
And full disclosure, I'm going to write a blog post with your answer.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, basement carpet, like I said, you don't always, when you start to see it on the carpet, it's really bad. You have to lift it in the corners, and you're looking for moisture on the tack strips, rust on the tack strips. If the tack strips are rusty and that rust is transferred to the carpet and you smell it up close.
That's
you know,
like every basement, though.
It
Every
is.
basement
That's what I
has
said.
rusty
Remember,
tack strips
Well, that's
and
what
rust.
Not
says
every-
you don't finish
Yeah.
basements.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you have sandy soil, you're on a hill, your gutters are great, and you run a dehumidifier, you might see a
There you go.
basement. And
That's
sometimes
okay,
the newer
yeah.
basements, they're really well insulated and waterproof. They don't suffer as much. But you're right, every basement, and that's
Okay.
why.
Okay.
Probably the next most common is, and I just read Reuben's post on this, sub-slab heat ducts.
Yeah.
I have seen snakes. One of my clients almost died from bacteria because she lived near a lake and water got in there. It caused a bacteria that went through her HVAC that caused a lung infection that went sepsis because the water was standing in there. So that's probably, if you have those, you probably have mold. And I struggled with that for a long time because a guy told me, I just had my ducts cleaned. I was like, well, I can still scrape the mold out. And so one summer I searched for everybody asking for a company that could clean them. And now I do know 2 companies that clean them very well.
Well, who are they? Throw them up there if you know them off the top of your head.
AdvantaClean
Okay.
and Ducks, DUCTZ. I didn't even know. Terry Kalinsky of Ducks has been a referral partner of mine for years. I didn't know he was doing the sub-slab, and he told me that other companies, other HVAC companies or duct cleaning companies go to Terry for the transite.
Okay.
They each use 2 slightly different approaches. I always felt like it needs to be something wet and scrubby, that abrasion enough with brushes is not enough to get this mold out of there. So AdvantaClean actually puts moisture down there and puts a rag on their brushes, and they can get them really clean.
On transite, too, which we talked about this in a previous podcast, right?
Yeah.
Asbestos, ductwork.
Yeah. And right after I read Reuben's post, I think I actually saw my first transite duct in a
Okay.
house that someone bought. I'm like, bring up this
timing.
post. And she looked it up and she goes, yeah, it looks just like it. And
we
she
go.
looked up your
Classes.
blog on site and she goes, I think this is transite. And I don't see
cool.
them because most of them I see are PVC. I
Yeah.
don't see that much transite, but I did see one. So, okay, so we got the attics, the transite.
Oh, wait. You said
Basement carpet,
Oh, yep, carpet.
sub-slab, and attics. you
Yep,
said
carpet,
then.
sub-slab, and attics. Another really common one is newer homes, fiberglass insulation above grade.
In the
Those little
basement?
spots, yes.
Like if it's an unfinished basement and they
Yes.
put poly over the fiberglass, you
Yep,
see it
and those little
behind
spots, they're
the
not
the poly.
dirt. They're mold.
You know what Pat Hillman calls that
What?
type of insulation method in an unfinished basement?
What?
The diaper method.
Well, I thought the diaper was, okay, on a cement wall, when you
Yeah.
put poly, then insulation, then poly.
Yeah.
But so these...
Are you talking about above grade or
Yeah,
below
well,
grade
so I was
walls?
mainly first talking about above grade. They're
Oh.
both problems. They are both huge problems.
I
Okay.
think Vickie's talking about
Above grade.
the walkout.
Yep, the
You're talking
walkout and
about
lookout
the
wall.
Okay,
walls.
okay.
Unfinished
Sure,
wall.
sure.
But
Yeah.
you're right. That's probably...
Okay.
a
Yep.
huge, and I tell everybody to take off the diaper system. But let's say you don't have that. Some basements you'll see
You
this.
got rid of those at like age 2.
Yeah, yeah. There was such a bad idea. So yeah,
Okay.
on a above grade walkout or lookout wall, when you see the fiberglass insulation and the vapor barrier over it, and there's a lot of little spots, that's mold.
I just had that this morning on
Okay.
an inspection all over the.
It's never the toxic black mold. There's not enough moisture in there. Back to Stachybotrys being a water indicator, that needs a direct leak. So this kind of mold, I put people's, in fact, I wrote a document and I had Pat review it because I said, I just give this to everybody. I email it to people I've never met because then I tell them it's nothing's wrong with your house. It's not a building defect. It's a building science phenomena. It is going to happen. And
That's
so
why Tessa's sitting here. She is our
Yeah.
conduit to the building science world.
I agree with you, Vickie, on that. I'd say the same thing to them. I mean, they freak out when they see it, and I say, well, if you've got poly and you've got rips and tears and unsealed areas, that warm, moist air is going to get behind there and
It
cause
does.
condensation. And
the first time I saw it slush behind the insulation, I'm like, oh my gosh. So then I had someone call a building scientist, and he's like, well, didn't seem that concerned. I went home to my same age house, same type of wall, went behind the insulation. I get ice crystals back there in the winter. Yep.
Okay,
Air can
so
move right
Tessa,
through
let's do this. Let's give Pat proper props. I mean, we've mentioned his name
we
like
need
17
Pat to
times.
come on this.
so,
You
on
do
this
need Pat to come on
podcast,
here.
Yes.
so please,
I'll reach out to Pat.
well,
and
but
we'll,
tell everybody who's listening who he is, because
Pat Holman. Yeah, he's a extension professor for the cold climate housing department at University of Minnesota. and his life has been building science, residential building science, and he teaches classes to students at the U and the bioproducts. I think they call it SSM now, Sustainable Systems Management degrees that study building science and all of this phenomena. But he kind of got into, we'll let him talk about it. But
Yeah, someday we're
he's
gonna
a
get
building
Pat
science.
in.
He's a
Yeah.
building science guru. He's
All
the
right,
building science.
all right.
Well, wait, we got 4 on this
Yeah,
list. Hold on, where's 5 before you?
Okay, so the 5th most common, well, probably then you're going to just water heater leaks, water softener leaks.
Well, bathrooms
Okay.
too, I guess. That we didn't even.
I mean, yeah, because
bathrooms are on the list, you'd say?
bathrooms, when we talked about
Yeah,
bathrooms
surface
on
mold.
the grout, no, but when you're, next to the shower, when the shower water leaks out and all of a
Okay.
sudden your baseboards are swelling and that's a very common place.
Okay.
Or wax ring leaks.
Okay.
All right, we're going to take a minute here and catch our breath, and then we're going to come back, and I swear we're going to talk about testing in this very next segment. You've been listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation.
Hi, everybody. Reuben Saltzman here with the Structure Talk podcast. We talk a lot about education on our podcast because this is one of our core values here at Structure Tech. To prove how important this is to us, we actually teach free continuing education classes to real estate agents all over the Twin Cities. We've been doing this for years, and we have classes ranging from 1 to 4 hours in length. These classes are taught by both me and Tessa. And if you're interested in having us come out to teach at your office, all you need to do is visit our website, click on the Education tab, and you can see instructions on how to get us out to your office. And you can also see a calendar of upcoming events. If you're interested in having us come out, please visit our website at structuretech1.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. I'm Bill Ulrich alongside Tessa Murray and Reuben Saltzman. And we have Vickie Swenson here with Minnesota Mold Inspections, LLC. Okay, Vickie, it's been a big buildup. Let's talk about testing. How do you go out to a house, and tell us about the testing procedure?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, no test tells you where it is.
Okay.
So a mold inspection, for the first hour, I'm really just looking for mold. I'm lifting that carpet. I'm using my moisture meter. I'm smelling windows. I am looking for it, looking and smelling, looking in these places that we talked about, looking in the ducts, looking at the insulation, looking at the attic. I do a lot of air testing, but I really only feel like it answers 3 questions well. If I see a big mold problem in one room, I won't even test that room. I know automatically what has to happen. That mold has to be removed, run an air cleaner, HEPA vacuum, everything. I'll test the room next door or above to see if spores have spread, and are there other areas that need to be cleaned other than the obvious. So that's one valid use of air testing. One is to figure out if it's in basement carpet. That type of mold is a spore factory. It's usually Aspergillus penicillium. It puts a lot of spores in. And just the lifting of the carpet, it'll come into the air on its own. But I do use it to see if there's mold in basement carpet, and I use it to clear a property after the mold is gone. I don't see any benefit to just go and run a test because, and this is what's happening with some other home inspectors, and I see these reports come to me all the time. Home inspector, because they figure they can make more money by running mold testing. They're not mold experts. They run a test, and then they're either looking for answers or it kills the deal. Because just running an air test by itself doesn't really give you any information. It's more, lets you know if there's spores in the air, but it doesn't tell you where it is. So I agree. And then you get to the situation where there are 5 conditions in which you can get a false negative air test. Meaning you have mold all around you. This happened when I worked for the federal prison up north. I was in the moldiest house I've ever been in, but it had been dormant for 20 years. So mold doesn't just grow and release spores at a constant rate. There are so many factors that can affect it. So I'm in this huge moldy room, no spores, because it's been dormant for 20 years. It's not going to try to release spores. So I have come to the conclusion, if it's too old, too cold, if it's a foreclosure, it's not going to release spores at 30 degrees.
Right.
Too wet, it's still a new colony. It's not ready to feel threatened to release spores. Or it's too sealed in the wall. And this is where it gets real dicey. If that vapor barrier, I've seen where windows, the framing studs are rotten, the insulation you can ring, but that vapor barrier protects the sheetrock, and there's very little indication that there's a problem. Or cladosporium, the most common attic-type mold. Cladosporium, I finally asked my lab, what's the deal? I'm reacting, I test it, you tell me it's cladosporium, I take a test, it's not in the air. Cladosporium has to be disturbed to release its spores. So too old, too cold, too wet, too sealed, or clado.
No.
You can have this mold around here, it's not going to be in an air test.
I gotta just kind of repeat what you just said about mold in the walls, because that's seems like it's everybody's biggest fear is we want to do intrusive testing. We want to know if there's mold in the walls. And it's like, all right, there's two very different things here. All right, why are you concerned that there's mold in the walls? Well, because we heard that stucco homes this age have a problem. Ah, okay, so you want to know if your walls are rotted. And you're assuming that to test for rotted walls, you need to test for mold. And there's this big jump in logic there. And the whole point is that you can't see that.
Oh, no. And as soon as I hear stucco, I send that to Structure Tech.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a stucco expert. That is a whole discipline on its own.
Yeah, invasive moisture testing is what we're talking about there, where
Yep.
somebody's going to come out and drill some small holes in the stucco and see if the sheathing is wet and or maybe gone because it's rotted away.
Yep.
Kind of piggybacking on that too, when we have clients, when we're working with buyers and they say, well, one of our main concerns is mold. We really want you to inspect this house and find any mold, and that, how do you do that? Because like you said, there's so many scenarios where even if you're testing for mold, you can't find it. And as a home inspector, when we're, if someone thinks that there's mold in the basement and it's completely finished, that sheetrock isn't wet a lot of the time.
no,
but does it mean that there isn't mold back there? No. And how do we inspect for that? Well, you really can't, especially, our SOP, right, Reuben? We follow the ASHI standards of practice. It says that we do not have to identify mold, right?
Interesting.
That's
I'm
something
paraphrasing.
that's specifically
I'm paraphrasing.
excluded from home inspection standards
Yes.
of practice is the identification of mold.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's a huge. I'm surprised I've made it 15 years because it is hard to know if it's in the walls. But in basements, if you have, I don't know what years they were doing this, putting fiberglass right on the cement with vapor barrier over it, that can generate a lot of odors and a lot of mold.
For a long, long time, people still do it.
Okay, I don't like it when I see that because that's just absorbing that.
Until 2015, it was you could do that by code.
Oh, really?
Yes. So in the last few years,
Trial
they've
and error.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, my favorite are the styrofoam panels wedged
Yes.
between the 2x4s, pulled a little bit towards the front, so there's a tiny air gap back there. Spray foam, I don't know a thing about that, but I'm not sure.
Oh, that just feels like a situation that's too permanent for my liking.
I say I have an unfounded mistrust of it. There's no reason I don't trust it, except for the mouse guy had my client take it out. The fire guy said it's too flammable. I just hear all the bad things about it, so I'm not an expert in that, but I just like the styrofoam panels in the
That'll
basement.
be another question we ask when we get Pat Hillman on here is what's the best way to insulate a basement or to finish a basement. And I'll tell you this, he's going to say don't do it.
I know.
Yeah, you remember we had him out at a seminar,
Yeah.
and I tried to corner him. I was like, I want you to present on this topic,
can't.
and he would not answer that question.
Yeah, well, I get his point. These are subterranean spaces that could be used for something. And when you build a house and you build space, it's hard to look at square footage that could be finished and walk away from it. That's a pretty tempting thing because building the porch addition onto your house is way more expensive than putting some drywall up in your basement and getting a few more square feet down there. So I get it from an economics perspective. I totally get it.
And I think that's why we have more mold, because mold is written about in the Bible. Every mold class starts with a reference to Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. And what I say, they called mold leprosy of homes. They would burn tents and clean stones. So I say somewhere between Bible days and 30 years ago, mold just became considered a household nuisance. But possibly when walls were plaster and had lead and mercury in the paint, that was a natural mold inhibitor. The walls weren't stuffed with fiberglass. They could dry out easier. We weren't finishing basements. We do have more mold today than we did.
Yeah.
Wow.
Definitely.
So you got to manage the water, number one.
It's all about the water, yep.
Managing heat, air, and moisture. Pat would call that a ham sandwich. How do you recommend cleaning this up? Every mold has a different recommendation, right? Like the attic, if it's in the attic, seal the attic bypasses. If it's in the basement and the carpet, rip it up. But if you rip up the carpet, how do you prevent it from coming back? And are there certain molds where you really you don't have a good solution to remediation or to prevent it from coming back?
That mold cleaning standard, the S520, and that is the name of its standard 520. It's published by a group called the IICRC, the Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration. So they call for removing mold, not killing it, because people always ask, well, does bleach kill mold? Well, technically, yes, it would, but in reality, no, because it evaporates, it bleaches it, makes it look like it's gone, but it evaporates so quickly it doesn't stay on the surface long enough, and those little roots in the pores can make the mold grow right back. So I say we're not trying to kill mold, we're trying to remove it, and that's really what the S520 calls for, getting it out of the house. So then it's depending on if it's growing on a surface that's porous, non-porous, or semi-porous. If it's growing on a semi-porous, you can't get carpet.
You have to remove it.
Yep, you get it out.
Okay. Like sheetrock. Sheetrock
Yep.
is porous.
Yep.
Can't clean it.
Sheetrock, carpet, insulation, you get out. So if it's on wood or concrete, on wood you vacuum it, sand it, treat it, and seal it. And on concrete, you're basically vacuuming and scrubbing it off. An attic, I still believe in the abrasive methods, vacuum and sand and treat. But because it's such a big space and it's hard to sand with all those nails, people are trying to look at chemicals that supposedly boil it out and you vacuum it up. The Indoor Air Quality Association, I think, is going to address that, removing mold with chemicals at their upcoming session this winter.
Where's that at? And can the general public attend?
Yeah, it's go to iaqa.org, and I think it's in Florida.
Sounds
and
good
it's in
already.
January.
I like that.
Yep.
January in Florida.
Yep.
We'll go learn about mold.
Yep.
Yes.
Everything air quality. The IAQA, when people call me from other states and they want a mold inspector in Chicago or wherever, the websites I trust are iicrc.org, iaqa.org, or the Indoor Air Quality Association, or the American Council of Accredited Certification. Those three websites. If you find someone on those, they're probably at least going to try to do a good job.
Okay, we'll link all of those up in the show notes. And the
S520.
Okay, is that something that the ordinary Joe
You have
would
to
read?
buy a copy. Some people have told me that if you go to that website, there's some information for free, but generally most people in the mold business end up buying a copy of it.
Okay, all right.
I think the EPA actually has some information about how to clean it up, like what you just said, and depending on the type of surface, if it's, porous, you have to get rid of it. If it's, a hard surface, you can scrub it. But do they recommend using some sort of soap solution and water, or
There are a lot of people using Dawn dish soap out there. Now, I am skeptical of that. I think it's okay. So basically, I'm just going to summarize the mold remediation. If it's a porous surface, you take it out.
Yeah.
You sand or remove it. While you're doing that, you have to run a big HEPA air cleaner. You have to do something with the air. So you either have to it's helped a woman get her spores from 10,000 down to 300 by putting a fan in the window and just sucking the air out of the room, creating, if it's only one room, that works okay. You can create negative pressure and take the air out. But otherwise, you need these big HEPA air cleaners. And the final step is to use a HEPA vacuum. And HEPA just means tighter filters, trap smaller particles. You want a HEPA air cleaner for the air and a HEPA vacuum. So when you're done getting the mold out, you vacuum every inch, every vertical and horizontal surface. Then you damp wipe it, and then you vacuum it again.
Wow.
And that's how you...
That would test my patience.
It's very green. It's a very green process. There aren't a lot of chemicals.
So just scrubbing a wall with bleach and water isn't going to do it. If it's growing on a basement wall.
If it's plaster, you're probably going to scrub it, but you should go to Menards. Some of the actual mold products have bleach or hydrogen peroxide in them, but they have something called surfactants that it's been explained to me, it makes it go further into the surface. I always thought it was longer, but it stays there.
How about concrete?
Concrete, you have to use something like Concrobia mold stain eraser. The guys that have the hard surface tile cleaner, a little mini power washer, but that can be effective on concrete.
Okay.
But not just hand scrubbing? That's not.
You can do that. I mean, it just depends how thorough you want to be and how big if it's just a little area, you're not going to hire the hard surface tool guy. You can just HEPA vacuum it, scrub it with Concrobium or a similar product, vacuum it again, scrub it again, and then you're probably going to, I don't like to say paint over it because now you've tried to remove as much as you can, but you will seal it or paint it. And this is, I always knew, like, if the wall has never been painted, you can put on a waterproofing paint. But if it has been painted, you can't put on a waterproofing paint. And I saw right here in Northeast Minneapolis once why you can't do that, because someone just put the waterproofing paint over the old blue paint, and now it's peeling off in sheets. So, but if it's been painted and you're getting it off a painted wall, there's a paint called Zinsser Perma White that works really well.
I think we're going to have to put a wrap on this, but this has been fantastic. Again, I've learned, leave it to the professionals. Don't do it yourself. DIY in my world is not a good acronym. Sorry for anybody who thinks that. But Vickie, thank you very much for coming in and talking about this. It's amazing information, and we're just scratching the surface. I mean, we could probably do 15 straight hours of this conversation and still not get really too far into it. Thank you, Vickie, very much for taking the time to spend with us this afternoon. Again, it's Minnesota Mold Inspections, LLC, mnmold.com if you want to look her up just on the web. You've been listening to Structure Talk, a Structure Tech presentation. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
For more information on how we can provide you with the right information about your home before you buy or sell, contact us at structuretech1.com.